Great stuff. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It really means a lot. I have to confess the talk that I gave to Bee Soup was initially intended for you guys, but I had a quite a bad reaction to my COVID vaccine, and then had to postpone things. So thank you for asking me to come back. I've modified the talk slightly because I had a feeling that quite a few of you might have already seen it. So I'll be covering some of the basic things that I mentioned and just revisiting them as a reminder, but throughout focusing mainly on seagrass. So yeah, I'll get cracking. I'll introduce myself as well for anyone that doesn't know me. Do let me know if you can see this okay. Someone just just so I know that you're all looking at the same thing that I'm
Looks
looking
fine.
at. Yeah, all good. Okay, great stuff. So yeah, I've titled this "The Art and Science of Underwater Photography" because I think it would be really nice to kind of encourage a movement within what we do of marrying up the creative aspect of photography with the applications to science and conservation. Um, so this is just a summary of what I'm going to cover. So I'll introduce myself for anyone that doesn't know me. I'll introduce seagrass as in terms of how it's a habitat as a species, well, as a collection of species. So there'll be some more basic content that I'll start off with for anyone that isn't a marine biologist, just to make sure that everyone's on the same kind of level playing field, and then go into what seagrass offers us and how it's a valuable habitat for other species as well. And then look at how seagrass is perceived by the general public, and some of the bigger threats that it faces, as well as local conservation issues. So we'll be quite UK centric, I have to confess, for anyone that's listening. That's got more of an overseas perspective. I've got quite a UK centric view on seagrass conservation, so I do apologise for that. And then the bigger picture, and looking, if you'll pardon the pun, at how your pictures and your imagery is beneficial for conservation, particularly with seagrass for reasons that I'll delve into later on. So, yeah, summarise. I felt that as someone that's quite young, as you mentioned, I'm 22. I'm in my penultimate year of my degree. I've taken a year out basically to get more experience in the field. So I'm currently working for Painton Zoo as a seagrass project assistant, and I'm helping with UK, well, mostly Torbay, sort of seagrass survey diving, organising and processing the data and things like that. But I started diving about 6 years ago now, and that's me. After doing my open water, I started with underwater photography quite quickly after that. And it's kind of been a spiral of obsession ever since. And then after that, I started to use my own kit, and I went for a phase of being absolutely infatuated with everything, and just I couldn't get over the fact that I could take images underwater. And this picture in particular was one of the first I took with my own camera, and I thought that it was the best thing I'd ever seen in my life, and naturally showed everyone that I possibly could. Um, and then a couple of years ago, I started to be able to afford some different wet lenses and a strobe. So I went from sort of budget video lights from Amazon for £20 to actually sort of understanding how I could sort of diversify the types of pictures that I'm taking. And then this is kind of where things have started to kick off for me. I was very fortunate in that I did well in the Bee Soup Splashing last year and won that. And since then, I've just been able to talk to so many new people, such as yourselves, and sort of spread the good word about sort of my science, but also my photography too. So I hope from there I can just interact with as many people as possible and encourage others to sort of not only use their images as an art form, but also to sort of get the good word out about what we can do and how we can actually inspire the general public with our images. So enough about me. I guess this sort of collage is where my interests lie. I feel like since I started diving, 90%, if not more, of my dives have been local, to the Portland and Weymouth area, and they've almost all of them are in sites or bays that have seagrass present in them. So I've been very lucky to be able to encounter a vast range of different species that all inhabit seagrass, and it's kind of it's just made me develop a real love for the habitat, from a very on a very personal level. But as a marine biology student, I've also got an academic interest in it as well. So I think I've got quite a very affectionate view of seagrass, but a lot of people don't share that. And I think that's really where the photography can come in, and videography as well. It's not exclusive. So just to summarize what seagrass really is, they're often grouped into sort of the same thing as seaweeds, but they're very different. They're flowering plants, or angiosperms, so they're exactly the same as our garden plants. They flower just like our garden plants. They have root systems and they pollinate as well. And some of the animals that live in the seagrass beds can help with that pollination too. So they're very stereotypically garden plant-like in their nature. And yeah, they complete their entire life cycle underwater. And they've recolonized the ocean multiple times, from fossil record information that we have. So we know that they came back and started colonizing the ocean 70 to 100 million years ago. They're basically doing what whales did and coming back into the oceans after evolving the ability to not be in the oceans, which is always interesting. And there's about 70 species worldwide, but most, in fact, all of the photos I'll be showcasing today will be in zoster and marina beds around the south coast of the UK. Unfortunately, I've not had the opportunity to dive in other parts of the world very much, so this is very UK and one species centric, but bear in mind there are lots of different species. So as a quick summary, I took this photo in Weymouth, and I thought it was quite a nice one for a few reasons, because you've got the zoster and marina, the seagrass at the bottom, but you've also got the sargassum, or Japanese fireweed, in it, which is an invasive species that has come over from Japan, and there's a lot of ecological studies going on at the moment because they can outcompete seagrass beds and sort of swamp areas of seagrass. Which obviously isn't ideal given the importance of seagrass. So both plants and algae photosynthesize, and they have a very leafy appearance, which is why it's often they're all just lumped in as one. But the difference is that seagrass is part of the plant group, so it has a completely different cell structure, and it's not organised in the same way. Algae are very complicated and very varied in how they're organised, whereas true plants like seagrass has a vascular system with a true root system that will uptake nutrients. And I made this just quick infographic because I always find it's easier to show someone what the differences are than tell them. So you've got a kind of classic plan of some seaweed on the left, with kind of leathery blades and gas bladders and a stipe, and the classic holdfast, which has no root, no role in kind of uptaking any nutrients. It's simply there to keep them attached to whatever substrate they're on. And then with seagrass, you've got a classic kind of grassy appearance, and they have very dense root systems known as rhizomes, the same as the grasses that, if any of you have an allotment, you might have been sort of digging through really dense grass rhizomes, and it's exactly the same for seagrass. They've got very dense root systems, and some of the flowers they have can look very small and look like little fronds. Others look more like a stereotypical flower, but they're not quite as charismatic as your garden flower. And just to highlight just how different they are, I've included this. It was an example that I was given in a lecture a few years ago, and I always find it a really fun one to use. So this bubble here with all of the tiny white branches represents sort of different groups of organisms. So the green little mapping point I've put in there is in seagrass. It's the seagrass's position, sort of all species of seagrass, their position relatively in this big bubble in the green plants, and they sit within all multicellular organisms. So they're organisms that have more than one cell. And then the blue is where the classic fucoid, the very common sort of shoreline wrack that we'll see if you've ever done any rock pooling or diving around the UK. It's just one that you'll naturally see everywhere. in the shallow intertidal, and that's all the way over here in a completely different algal group. So to put that into perspective, the yellow is a mushroom, and they're within the Episthecontas, which basically mean that they have like motile sperm and things like that. And the grey is us. We're also in that group. So we are more closely related to mushrooms than seagrass is related to other seaweeds. They couldn't really be further from each other in terms of the differences. So yeah, that's basically a summary of what seagrass is. I hope that gives you a fairly broad understanding, and I hope that it's not covering too much of sort of basic content. I just wanted to make sure that everyone's sort of got a firm understanding of what seagrass really is. And if you've ever dived in seagrass, I'm sure you'll know that they grow in dense beds known as meadows. The metaphor of them being like garden plants doesn't stop at how they grow and how they live. They also sort of populate in dense meadows. And they're typical of shallow coastal waters. They can be found at greater depths, but it's less common, and only a few species are found at slightly greater depths. But they tend to cut off at around the 20-metre mark. But the main thing that seagrasses are sort of known for ecologically is that they host hundreds of associated species, and that can be other seagrasses too, or algae to crabs and dugongs. If you spend any time in a seagrass meadow, either UK or abroad, there's kind of endless amounts of species that you can find, whether it's rooting through the sediment and looking for isopods and things like that, or more charismatic megafauna that you might find abroad. And this is just a quick synopsis of how sort of widely distributed seagrass beds are around the world. The only continent that doesn't have seagrass is Antarctica. Everywhere else has some form of seagrass species or another, and particularly around the tropics, some seagrass beds can have 12 to 15 seagrass species within one area. So it's pretty impressive. They're doing quite well in terms of their general range. And then I guess this is one of those things that is kind of a staple for any ecology course, really, and it's often used as a way of talking about seagrass to the general public. The cynic in me is sort of reluctant to use it because the term ecosystem services is a way of basically monetizing any service that a species or a habitat offers us, and kind of trying to find a way of saying, okay, well, if we were to do the things that this species or habitat does, how much would it cost us? So it's an ecosystem service is basically the benefits provided by ecosystems that contribute to making human life both possible and worth living. So it encompasses quite sort of non-essential services in terms of just general enjoyment, but also essential services like food too. So seagrass is often listed as something that provides us with a vast range of ecosystem services. And as I mentioned, with those really thick rhizomes and root systems, they have the ability to help with flood defense. There's some really interesting wave tank experiments where they sort of simulate different wave conditions, and seagrass consistently helps protect, acts as a sort of natural barrier for landmarks and things like that. And also by supporting fisheries. So a lot of different gadoid species use seagrass as a nursery, both commercial and subsistence species too. But if you dive in seagrass at the moment, actually there are a lot of fry fish in the water, a lot of various gadoids, whether it's sort of poor cod or Atlantic cod. There's plenty about at the moment. It's that perfect boom time for fry, and they are absolutely everywhere, which is always lovely to see. But then they'll go off into deeper water once they're older, so they're a great nursery for a variety of different fish. And yeah, our classic cod chips. Seagrass indirectly plays a role in delivering that to us, our seaside favourite. And then in some other communities worldwide, there are people that depend on it for for food, not commercially, but for subsistence. I believe this was taken in Indonesia somewhere. But things like sea cucumbers and a lot of shallow intertidal invertebrates and mollusks are harvested from seagrass, and they're a really important food source for more remote communities around the world as well, not just in the UK. And another classic that's often thrown about is the storing carbon, and blue carbon is becoming a big thing that people are looking at. We've always considered the rainforests and a lot of terrestrial plant life as a great source of helping us tackle our carbon issue, but the seas are an amazing carbon store, and while seagrass beds only occupy 0.1% of the ocean surface, a ridiculously tiny amount, they are thought to be responsible for 10 to 18% of carbon burial in our oceans, so are very, very important in terms of carbon storage, which is obviously becoming increasingly vital. And then just from a general biodiversity perspective, whether it's commercial or subsistence, there are lots of different species that are completely dependent on seagrass, whether it's small animals living in the sediment or animals that directly utilise and graze on seagrass. And I had to include some megafauna photos by other people because unfortunately I don't have any. Some of the classics that we all know and love and are absolute staples of underwater photography and just general marine conservation and outreach use and predate / graze in seagrass beds around the world. And then from more of a bias perspective, I guess, I mentioned about being a bit cynical about the whole concept of ecosystem services, because as a diver and underwater photographer, I'm sure many of you will relate, I don't feel like we need to justify conservation with money, or even, saying about particular services it will offer, in that it's beautiful and it's amazing to enjoy recreationally, and that in itself gives it innate value for us we should be striving to protect it regardless of what services it offers us. So in summary, seagrass habitats are complex, valuable ecosystems, but is there a mismatch between how valuable they really are and what people think about them? I don't know if they're necessarily regarded as such. This is an anecdote I've used a few times now, so I do apologise if you've already heard me go through it before. But this is sort of a classic for me that I always say to people, because it really kick-started a fire in me to make sure that I use my images more than for just sort of sitting on a hard drive and playing about in Photoshop with. I actually make sure that I share them with others, especially local communities that may not have seen the kind of animals and habitats that we have on our coastline. Basically, at London Aquarium, I worked there for a short period, and we did various sort of activities with children about ocean education and trying to encourage people to be inspired by local marine life. And the way that it worked is that we had a collection of all different sorts of species on little cards, and we asked them to sort them out. And the species ranged from orca to some really beautiful sort of pinks and purple nudibranchs, and then things like mackerel, cod, blue shark, basking shark, barrel jellyfish, a real range of species, pelagic and benthic. And we asked them, both the staff and the students, to sort them into species they thought were native and can be found in the UK, and species that they thought were strictly exotic and found elsewhere in the world. And you can probably, if you haven't heard this before, you can probably guess where this is going. The sorting activity resulted in any colourful and conventionally cute animals being put in the tropical species pile, and then any grey and less traditionally charismatic animal being put into the native species pile. But of course, the grand reveal was that they were all native species, which always got a few gasps from both staff and student alike. And it shocked me because I've always been one of those people that's, I guess, sad enough to spend a lot of time reading and looking on obscure identification groups and seeing kind of, oh, what's this rock pool species someone's found, and there's always someone that knows exactly what it is. And I always enjoyed consuming that kind of thing and working out sort of where things were around our coastline. But a lot of people don't have that inclination. which is perfectly fair enough. And so they just don't have that exposure to the kind of broad diversity of marine life that we have. And again, traditionally, charismatic and colourful species are less likely to be associated with UK waters, and this is something that's been mentioned in various public perception literature from Natural England and other institutions in the UK. So unfortunately, it is more of a widespread issue than just my London Aquarium anecdote. And that doesn't have to be sort of charismatic as in megafauna and sharks, even just small humble species like a tompot blenny, which is a bit of an intertidal staple, is often identified as being non-native just because it's pretty. Whereas plain and less colourful species are more commonly associated with UK waters, so your sort of general mollusks and a lot of commercial gadoids and things like that. But it's not just the type, it's also the amount of wildlife that's not often kind of identified. So in a recent public perception survey of around 3,000 people, they were asked about the features and the characteristics of the seabed beneath the region where they live or where they visit off the coast. And 44% of them considered the seabed generally, mostly, or utterly barren. And I'll try not to be too dramatic and use too much hyperbole, but I was quite shocked to read that. I guess when you're exposed to something all the time, you sometimes assume that other people would have similar exposure and similar enjoyment for it. But a lot of people just don't know it's there. And then this is where I come back to the seagrass, with the interest in ecological value and this mismatch between how valuable a species or habitat is and how much it's sort of valued by the public. And what these Natural England surveys found was that native species with the greatest ecological value, so by that I mean they host more species, they can provide us with more carbon storage, they're better sort of hosts for commercial species, all of those ecosystem services that I mentioned, they're typically regarded as less interesting, and they were actually the least interesting when asked to sort of rank on a numbered list of how interesting they thought each species was. And 65% of the respondents in this survey recognised seagrass, but less than 10% listed seagrass as a species they'd like to know more about. But obviously, seagrass in itself is beautiful and it's very atmospheric to dive in. If any of you have dived in it, I'm sure you have. But with this whole survey, one of the most interesting things for me, at least, was that the seahorse, one of the classic charismatic elusive species of UK waters, was marked as the most interesting. But of course, it's entirely dependent on seagrass beds. But the public are much more interested in the kind of sweetness and charismatic fauna rather than the habitats themselves. And that's where I feel photography has the power to sort of create that inspiration. People, without trying to sound too arrogant, people have responded really well to the photo that I took on the right for the bee soup splash-in, even people that aren't particularly interested in the marine environment. And I think sometimes just being able to capture something that makes some people feel something is really important, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have an animal subject in shot. And this is more important than ever with some of these species, whether it's merle beds or kelp forests or seagrasses, because literature increasingly is showing us that we are losing vast amounts of these habitats in the UK, based on studies where they have modelled kind of shallow water habitats in the UK that have the potential to have seagrass present. A vast majority of them no longer do. And it's estimated that seagrass meadows have shrunk by around 92% in UK waters, which is quite an astounding amount. But if you look at some of the older grey literature and sort of historical records that haven't been sort of formally put into sort of the scientific literature yet, we know that land reclamation has really changed a lot since the profile of a lot of our shallow water habitats, whether it's sort of dense oyster beds that used to be present along Plymouth and salt marshes, or seagrass, there's been vast dynamic changes in the last sort of 100, 200 years where things have changed a lot, but it's not actually been recorded very well. So some of the larger scale threats I'll cover fairly briefly. I want to sort of go on to talk to about the sort of local issues that many of us are probably familiar being UK divers, but land reclamation, as I mentioned, is one of the things that can impact seagrass meadows, either by destroying them entirely or just reducing their expanse or density. So by blocking light for growth or increasing sedimentation or just completely covering it. Excessive nutrients from farming is a really big one around a lot of coastal areas, and of course seagrasses are exclusively found in coastal areas. It might be through fish farming or from agricultural usage, from land runoff. Yeah, so sediment and pollution from that as well kind of go hand in hand. But also lack of tools and research to make informed decisions. That's another big one. But fortunately, seagrass is starting to get a lot more recognition in the last few years, and it seems to be a real buzz topic at the moment for academics, but also for sort of a lot of outreach. I've been seeing a lot more people talking about seagrass within my sort of wider comms bubble, and I hope that other people are noticing the same thing. And just, as I mentioned, manual uprooting and destroying of seagrass through various developments, whether they're in water or out of water. And lack of awareness, which is, I guess, where I'm coming from with the underwater photography and what I'll go on to speak about shortly. It is harder to pass protection laws, and it is harder to make real change if people just aren't aware of the presence of these habitats and the amazing species that live with them and within them in the first place. So I'm sorry, this image is essentially 2 pixels. I couldn't actually find any decent footage of the issue that I wanted to address here, but this is from a scientific paper, and this is the best I could find. So I'm sure many of you have probably heard about the mooring chain issue, which drag along the seabed as the tide changes, and this is very common in a lot of recreational boating areas that are sort of hotspots for mooring, whether it's sort of Corsan Bay in Cornwall. Studland is a big one that's mentioned a lot on the south coast. But you can see from this drone footage here that the darker areas of the seagrass have these big scrapes, where you get these circular sort of bare sediment from the mooring chains dragging along, which damages the seagrass. And there is a lot of local conflict about this. It's been something that many people invested in conservation have been fighting for over a decade now, but we've finally seen with Studland and in Portland Harbour recently, close to me, that people are starting to listen. Unfortunately, it's taken far longer than it should have done, but we're starting to make waves with that. But there is hope again. These eco moorings are starting to be sort of tested and hopefully utilised more widely on the south coast. This is one I took in Corsan Bay, just over from Plymouth, and they're basically, it's a very simple idea, but it's a brilliant one. Basically using a collection of buoys along the chain just to stop that manual scraping along the seabed. And also a lot of different monitoring projects have been going on, whether it's the Community Seagrass Project that was running for quite a few years. I'm not sure if any of you are involved with that, or some of the stuff that I'm involved with now in Torbay. There's a lot of people that are interested in working with seagrass now, which is really positive. And academic and government interest, as I mentioned, that is really starting to sort of kick up. And I think part of that is a materialistic interest, but also part of it is that finally people are catching on, both the public and sort of people within government. And you, people like yourselves, VSUP, the Bristol group as well, like there are lots of people that are engaging with fantastic habitats and taking outstanding images all the time, and everyone has the ability to use that experience that they have and those amazing images that they have for a variety of different reasons in a variety of different ways that can make real change. I know conservation can often feel a bit pessimistic because there's always something that that's going on, and there's often it's very much an uphill battle. But there are tangible things that you can do with your pictures that will make a difference. And I guess the main thing, I highlighted this a lot in my bee soup talk, but building connections is really important. And it's why places like zoos, albeit they are contentious, do help people build those connections. But underwater imagery has that capability without having to take people to those places. And a personal experience of marine environments has been found to be important for developing an interest and support of conservation. And that's been found in people of all ages, all political agendas. It seems to be a very widespread thing that if someone has personal experiences of a habitat, they're much more likely to get involved in supporting it, supporting conservation efforts to protect it. And another way, I didn't mention this so much in my previous talk because I wanted to make it very imagery focused, but quite frankly, I think the two go hand in hand. If you're taking images, even if you're not a marine biologist and isopod taxonomy and shrimp taxonomy isn't your favourite pastime, it really doesn't matter. Any record that you have, anything that you notice is a bit different to usual, any commercial species you see, any litter, any sort of disease or higher amount of sort of algal bloom, anything like that is really, really important. And I think it's often quite difficult for people to sort of cross over into that side of recording because it does feel a bit intimidating. But you don't have to be a sea search surveyor to be contributing really valuable records, whether it's through Sea Search themselves or through your wildlife trusts or through iRecord, which is basically a very similar platform to which Sea Search use, and basically means that the recordings that you put in of any species can be accessed by anyone, which is really valuable in the event that someone is making a decision about an area. It's one of the places that they'll look for looking at species records. And the same for Sea Search as well. If you are a Sea Search observer, you don't have to complete entire dive forms to say everything about your dive. You can just complete a form to say, hey, I saw this species, it's quite rare, I think you should know about it. So don't worry if you haven't plotted your exact route or you don't know all of your exact depths and you haven't sort of made an effort to identify everything you've seen on that dive. There's a no obligation kind of, if you've seen an important species and you want to record it, do just get in touch. Like, we need it more than ever. It's really, really important. There's lots of kind of political kind of contention around how records are used and who does what with records and people pointing fingers. But as long as you're making an effort, then that's all you can do on an individual level. And engaging with others. So again, building connections and using the pictures that you have. This doesn't just apply for seagrass, but of course I may be a little bit biased because I am mildly obsessed with it. But engaging with others and showing them, whether that's friends or family or social media, and it doesn't have to be a shot that's won an award. It can have as many technical imperfections as you like, as long as it's an image that is of something and it's clear what that thing is. And if it's not clear, then hopefully you can explain it to people. Then there's no reason why you should feel embarrassed about sharing it with others, because it's such a powerful thing to do. That was fairly short and sweet, but here's a list of references. I can either pop those over, and if anyone wants to do any further reading about the stuff that I've mentioned. But also I just wanted to highlight a couple of organisations that I'm either involved with or know about. The Life Recreation Remedies Project is one that's going on with a lot of SACs in the southwest, and they're doing some amazing work kind of raising awareness about seagrass but also monitoring it too. So if you wanted to read more about what's going on locally and kind of a UK based project, then I really recommend checking them out. Project Seagrass is a great one. It's another citizen science project where you can record things that you see within seagrass and also just let them know that you've seen seagrass in particular areas. It's pretty intuitive to use. You don't have to have any particular expertise or any inclination with worm taxonomy or anything like that. It's a great one to check out. And then Sea Search as well. It'd be wrong for me to not mention Sea Search just because they're one of the classic sort of pioneers for diving and snorkeling citizen science in the UK. So I hope that was of use. I hope that was insightful. I'm sorry that there was some overlap with what I spoke about with bee soup, but hopefully that was of use. I'm hoping that you all could hear me throughout that.
Very well. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think anyone who's taken pictures of any critters in the UK will have surprised people with the sort of variety and beauty and sort of general interesting nature of what there is to be seen around here. So would one expect to find seagrasses at any latitude around the British Isles, do you think?
Yes, there's I mean, I have to admit I haven't done a lot of up north sort of diving, but there are some in Scotland, I know, and there are some I think there's some on the east coast as well. There shouldn't be, in terms of the theory behind it, I don't think there's any reason why there wouldn't be any at higher latitudes at all. But I don't know too much about the exact sites where you might find them. If anyone does, feel free to chip in.
The closest one to you guys, in Manchester, is probably Roscommon Bay, just on Anglesey.
Really?
Yeah. Just make sure you dive at high tide, because the water disappears at low tide. I've done that with Sea Search a few times. Yeah, you might get max depth about 8 meters, but
yeah,
but it's a lovely site.
We've done one dive there and just stuck around some rocks and hardly moved. To be honest, it was fantastic. But yeah, we didn't find anything flat enough. I don't think at that point.
It took me a couple of attempts to find the seagrass, to be honest. But once you find it, you're like, how did I miss it?
Well, that's something to aim for. But yeah, even
it's got
divers.
Toilets.
Yeah. Even divers have this sort of approach. It seems. We went up to Loch Striven for an archaeology project, and the guys told me, yeah, there's nothing there. It's completely dead. It's barren. It's a sea loch, and of course, there's dozens of species of stuff there, and cool critters to photograph. And yeah, I was doubtful before I went in, obviously, but yeah, I was kind of shocked by that approach. There wasn't.
Crickets is part of seagrass, actually.
What's that, Ken?
Crickets, that's where I've dived on seagrass, very shallow.
Yeah, it's definitely not what you'd pursue if you want to get any real depth, that's for sure. I've spent a lot of my dive sort of max depth 2 meters, 3 meters, and it's effectively a snorkel, but
yeah, that's what it's like a cricket thing.
But there's some on the Swanage Pier, as I remember.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, either side of Swanage Pier.
Just off to the side, yeah.
But yeah, we've only seen it down on the south coast, I think. And yeah, I was certainly aware of the Studland Bay mooring issues.
Yeah.
It's a community seagrass initiative. Is that still going? Because I did a few dives with them a few years ago.
No, it's disbanded, but there are some sort of volunteer projects still going on that have kind of come off the back of that.
Okay.
So the National Marine Aquarium are doing quite a lot of work with trying to basically plant and seed areas in Plymouth Sound, and they sometimes take on volunteers if you look on their Facebook group. So if you were in that area, that's one place that they're still running. And in Tor Bay, Paynton Zoo are running the Save Your Seagrass initiative, which is basically doing very, very similar stuff to CSI, but it's just not the same in terms of who's running it.
Cool, yeah. No, it's been a few years since I've dived with them, so it's just gone quiet over the last few years, but that'll be why.
Yeah, I think they ran out of funding in the end, so they had to disband, unfortunately.
So is everyone using seahorses, do you think, to kind of engage the
To be honest,
public?
that's why that's why I volunteered. I kind of thought I might be able to get to see a seahorse in the UK, and I never did.
Yeah.
And that's how I sold it to guys at Fulton Area Divers, and they never sold it either. But you know, a few seagrass beds got edits even got mapped out.
Yeah, this is it. Those species are like, they're perfect for engaging the public without a doubt. And I think that you can be a bit sneaky in that you can get them interested in the charismatic species and then start telling them more about where they live, and they'll suddenly be interested in that too. But yeah, I mean, some of the ethics of what's been going on with seahorse photos is a bit interesting. And I don't know if you've seen some of the photos that have been coming out recently. I've seen a lot of heated discussion about that. So that's
It's
probably for
talking about
another
one thread
day.
that there's a seahorse on a mask and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, that's it. I hope that was useful, guys. I'm sorry that there was some duplication, but hopefully that was of some use.
Great, thank you.
Cool,
Thank
great
you.
stuff. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Round of
Thank you.
applause, everyone.
Thank you.